Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Mike Mason from Chaosium, the Call of Cthulhu creative director.
Thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about Call of Cthulhu Arkham. We spoke previously about pretty much like what is this book exactly. And today I was thinking that we can discuss some of the more interesting aspects about the book. We could get a little more spoilery. I've been checking out the reviews for Call of Cthulhu Arkham just to see what people are saying. For the most part, everyone seems to love this book. And there was only one criticism someone had, and it wasn't really criticism about the book. It was they were so overwhelmed with information, they weren't sure what to do with it. So I figured we could talk a little bit about that. So yeah, I want to say that I love this book. This copy here was not sent to me by Chaosium. They did send me a PDF, but I love this book so much. I said I had to get a printed copy, and I'm glad for it because I didn't realize it that this came with a map, two maps, I believe,
Yeah,
and
two
uh,
maps.
and a newspaper, which is really awesome. Something great that I could give to my players to look at before we start the game, to give them the feel of it. So let's talk a little bit about how we could use this book as a tool for keepers to use for their games. Let's talk about ways in which we can introduce this setting to players. And usually you could start there, or your characters could come from someplace else to go over there. And one of my favorite, I don't know if anyone remembers the Real Ghostbusters cartoon series from way, way back. But I remember this is probably the first time I ever heard of Cthulhu as a kid. There was this episode, I believe it's called The Collect Call from Cthulhu.
Yeah.
Um, Something like that. And the Ghostbusters had to go to the university there to try to figure out how to beat Cthulhu. Mike, if I may ask, what was your experience being introduced to Cthulhu or to Lovecraft's work? How did that happen?
I mean, it is through the game where I really became aware of authors like Lovecraft and August Derleth and Ramsey Campbell and so forth and Clark Ashton Smith. It's really through the game. I mean, I'd been a kind of voracious reader, particularly of horror and sci-fi in my youth, and I'm pretty sure that without knowing it, I had consumed some mythos stories when I was young. Because I got into Call of Cthulhu when I was about, I don't know, age 14, 15, maybe about 15, I guess. And so, but it wasn't until I started playing the game when the authors' names became apparent to me in terms of this game is based on, these stories written by various authors, particularly Lovecraft, obviously. Um, when I was reading the game, that I then went back and looked through my books and tried to find some of these stories. And, I think I found one, maybe a Lovecraft story. And then I went out searching for mythos stories and, through secondhand bookshops. But effectively, I was, truly introduced to the kind of Cthulhu mythos through the Call of Cthulhu game. I think, like many people at the time, it was, Lovecraft and particularly Cthulhu had not yet kind of really squelched into the mainstream as much as they are, today in that sense. Cthulhu is kind of everywhere in a sense. You can find him on board games and plushies and all sorts, cartoons and whatnot. Whereas back then, there was none of that. The only place you could find Cthulhu was in the Call of Cthulhu game. And if you really searched hard, some old second-hand paperback or hardback kind of fiction collections, because it was kind of out of print to some degree. And so that was my introduction, I guess.
I remember the Carpenter movies in the '80s, how they were incredibly influenced by it, and it wasn't too much later I realized, oh, that's stuff I'm reading. It's how everything's all linked together and everything. Do you recall first being introduced to the Arkham books originally? The
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was by the time the first edition of what was then Arkham Unveiled came out, I was a dyed in the wool Call of Cthulhu keeper and running lots of things and writing my own scenarios. So I bought Arkham Unveiled when it first came out and read it through and enjoyed it, and then I used bits of it in different scenarios I ran. I don't think I actually ran an Arkham campaign at the time because my play group was kind of fairly fragmentary, and we kind of do a lot of one shots. But I'd used bits of Arkham in those one shots occasionally, but I didn't really run a campaign set there. But yeah, it was what what I liked was this kind of really getting immersed in this kind of mythos kind of setting, this kind of fictional place where I think, as you said earlier, you can kind of meld it into what you want it to be, and meld it into something useful for the type of game you want to run, be that a kind of a one shot set in a house in Arkham, or a whole campaign.
You've done a great job in making this book feel like a New England. This belongs in New England. If I may ask, was there anything outside of the Arkham books that you researched from or gathered from to create it? Are you
Yes.
from New England?
No, no, no. I born and live in England, so so the only connection is that the word England it's similar as in New England and England where I live. But no, there's two kind of research avenues that I went down when I started to work on the Arkham book. One was clearly the fiction, the kind of the mythos stories where Arkham is mentioned, particularly in Lovecraft's early tales. But there were some others. August Derleth had talked about Arkham in some of his later stories and collaborations. Um, and and the game world. If we count all that as fiction, so a lot of for 40 years, Call of Cthulhu has been pumping out scenarios, and some of them have been set in Arkham, and each of them kind of takes its own kind of view of Arkham and uses it in a different way, or builds on what was done in Arkham Unveiled. But essentially, a lot of kind of fictional material about Arkham that I could kind of research and kind of think, well, does that fit with this version of Arkham? Is that kind of fall outside, or is that a cool idea we can maybe borrow? So that was one side to it, and then the other side was actually the real stuff that you're talking about. Real New England, real Massachusetts, and so part of the research that I did was to actually look into the histories and the folklore and the customs of new smallish New England towns. Salem's a good example, but it's quite large now. So there's a lot of smaller places that do that, that are real, that are not far from Arkham that I could use as kind of inspiration. What kind of societies might be there? What does a historical society tell me about the local area? And is there something that we could kind of borrow again to kind of put into Arkham and give it that sort of sense of reality, that kind of sense of place that is particularly New England. So yes, so there's those kind of research down those two avenues, and kind of had two different kind of books of things, and then it was kind of pulling together different threads from those avenues of research. The other thing I should say is, obviously, I know some people that live in New England. Brian Courtmanche, who is a Call of Cthulhu writer, lives near, well, just Boston area, and he's a librarian. So I was able to kind of send some kind of information I'd researched in terms of factual stuff, and kind of get him to kind of check it and make and advise on things I might have missed, or here are some opportunities you might want to go and look at. There's a book on New England folklore, monsters and ghost stories and that kind of thing that I wasn't aware of, that I could go and look at. So using my own kind of research through the internet and libraries, but also making use of some great people who are happy to kind of help out with a bit of research and advice from the area. Really helped in that way.
Hmm. So I figured let me talk about. I'll bring up some important aspects about New England towns, and we could talk about how we could use that as a gateway for keepers to use that for the games.
Yeah.
Um, Graveyards. Let's talk about graveyards a little bit. In New England, it's pretty fascinating. I know graveyards in itself are very spooky. Interesting settings. I think anyone that's watched any zombie movie, uh, graveyards are a part of that. But in New England, I've noticed it's very interesting. It's very historical, very artsy. In fact, some towns have many graveyards, which I think that really surprises people. There's this one town nearby here they have seven graveyards.
Yes.
In
Yeah.
there, and they none of them are less important than the other. They have graveyard committees, which I find that really fascinating. People that get together and talk about how to upkeep all these graveyards, make sure they stay beautiful and well kept. And um, to me, maybe because I'm a New Yorker, I grew up in New York. To me, that sounds almost insane. Well, not insane, but it's just like, wow, I can't believe that such a thing exists. Um, how 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 do graveyards you feel work in Arkham?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good thing to kind of pinpoint down on because graveyards for any any kind of community are kind of serve a number of purposes. And in terms of gaming, they're a great way to kind of convey a sense of history of the town to the players in terms of the kind of feel for the past. And so with Arkham, it was very much a case of kind of what do these what do the graveyards kind of what can they tell us, and how can they kind of aid the kind of the idea of designing games around them and scenarios and plots. Um, but also the other aspect is, like you say, Arkham's got more than one graveyard. I mean, the thing about graveyards is after a certain time they get full, and you have to find somewhere else to put people. And so Arkham is very much very much like that. It's got the old wooded graveyard, which was one of the original graveyards used, but it's full, and it's, as the book sort of says, it's not been used since the early 1800s, and so it's got a lot of its tombs and headstones got 17th century inscriptions and before, which means they're a great potential source for clues or information about people that existed in the town before. And you can kind of think about these kind of family histories, and particularly in a game like Call of Cthulhu, where that could be a really useful clue to kind of tell you about the modern families. Look at the past, and it's a really easy way to go. And well, we need to go and find are there any headstones for the Graves family in the graveyard, and you can obviously as a keeper then kind of build that in and put that in, and that can then send them off to look at newspapers. So you can build the whole kind of clue network around these kind of things. Now that's all mundane stuff, because obviously the other side to Arkham is the mythos, the horror, and as we know in Call of Cthulhu, you've got creatures like ghouls that we know live in graveyards. So that's a whole kind of other thread there to kind of pull on, is not only as a research thread to kind of do family kind of histories, but also encounters with the horrific. So what are the stories about the graveyards, and what how can those pull the investigators into being in the graveyard at 3 o'clock in the morning with torch flashlights, looking around, waiting for something to happen, and then something happens, and they have to deal with it. Even to the extent of they find they need, for some reason, need to exhume a body that was buried in the 17th century, and they either legally or illegally perform that disinterment, and then find an empty coffin with a big hole in it, and maybe some cryptic clue, and a big hole going down into the earth. If you're a Call of Cthulhu investigator, well, are you going to go down the hole and find out what happened? That kind of thing. So you can build these plots in, and then that's just ghouls are one thing. There's Hangman's Hill in Arkham, where you've got allegedly the ghost of Goody Fowler appears on certain nights of the year, and then, well, who's Goody Fowler? Then you can go and research Goody Fowler's history and suddenly find, oh, they're one of the people that was accused of witchcraft at the very founding of Arkham. And there's loads of legends about whether Goody died or didn't die, and whether there's cursed or some sort of things going on. And again, that's suddenly a whole new plot and a whole new kind of scenario to you to get into. That's a few. I've just thought of another one. There's one of the kind of mundane aspects of graveyards is who looks after them. And so, one of the graveyards in Arkham is tended by I think the eldest son of the nearby funeral home, who doesn't want to inherit the funeral home. He's kind of like one of those people who's kind of like, that, this is the last thing I want to do, but because of kind of society and family pressure, he can't escape. but he's tending this graveyard and is kind of a bit disgruntled kind of thing. And how can that be brought in? How can his kind of wanting to escape this life become part of the plot? Maybe he's a friend of an investigator. Maybe in tending the graveyard, he discovers something. He discovers a murder, or some item has been left behind, or some artifact is kind of coming up through the soil that he discovers as he's mowing the lawn. And suddenly that's a whole other plot to go with. But so all these kind of different kind of permutations just around the graveyard just can inspire lots of different types of story, not just ghouls, which are the obvious one for Arkham, but for many others as well. um, and and so that kind of trying to give each of the graveyards in Arkham a slightly distinct character, slightly different feel. So I've mentioned the old wooded graveyard, which is really old, and in the middle of it, it's got Hangman's Hill, where hangings used to take place, and where this ghost may or may not appear. And then you've got Christchurch Cemetery in South Arkham, which is the new graveyard, which is all kind of, like you imagine a more modern day one might look now, in terms of very landscaped and ornamental, and paths running through it, and rather than been left to kind of rot and ruin. So you've got these different characters for the different places. So again, the players themselves can start to kind of get a feel for it. So they're not all carbon copies. It's not just a graveyard. It's that graveyard, and then there's that graveyard, which is different, and there's a different feel to it, and there's a different kind of atmosphere, because perhaps the ghouls aren't there yet. They haven't made their way to South Arkham. Perhaps, I don't know. So they all kind of build possibilities, which is what ultimately what the Arkham book is all about. It's possibilities. Here's information. It's up to each kind of play group to realize the possibilities for them in terms of what they want to kind of explore, and what stories they want to tell. Because there's a lot of stories that can come out of the Arkham book, and each group will have their own flavor and type of stories that they're going to want to explore.
History is very important for New England towns. It's very interesting. It seems like every town, especially if they had some little thing to do, let's say for example with the Revolutionary War, they will grasp onto that and make like maybe a day of celebration out of it, maybe make a museum out of it. History and the especially that time period, the colonial time period, is very important to New England towns. And I was impressed that you brought that into the book as well. Um, what were there anything about that really interested you when you put that or updated that for Arkham?
Yeah, I think the one thing I felt was missing was that pre-colonial history. I felt that the Ar- you know the land of Arkham, if you call it that, clearly existed before any white settlers got there, and so to me that's as important as the white settler history. So that's a part that I kind of had to do some kind of historical research to kind of understand, what communities were on the land before colonization, and what that meant, and then also the unfortunate effects of colonization on those peoples as well, in the kind of the outcomes, which are not good in that sense. So I wanted to kind of ensure that was appropriately represented, that it wasn't just I guess a white history of Arkham, because that seems to, well, it's not the full history, is it? If you only focus on one sort of set of people. So that was an area that I wanted to kind of expand, and kind of bring up to date in terms of ensuring people understood what happened, what the land was before colonization, and then thereafter, um, what are the? It's very hard, because obviously you're trying to write the history of a fictional town, but base it in some semblance of reality, as in what was happening around the real places in New England at the time, and trying to kind of parallel them without necessarily stealing from them, in a sense. So you want to kind of be informed and inspired without kind of basically just copying the history of Salem, because that would be kind of disrespectful to Salem in that sense. So it's kind of building it together and building this kind of jigsaw to make it feel real whilst it's still fiction, effectively. But the whole kind of founding, and what what the impact of the revolution, what are the key points in American history, Revolutionary War, Civil War, and so forth. How do they impact? Because they are kind of touchstones and common points that everyone's familiar with, in terms of understanding where that, how they impacted on the town, and what happened thereafter. Equally, things like the Great War in 1917 for the USA. So, and especially that's kind of important as well, particularly for Call of Cthulhu if you're playing in the 1920s period, because it means a lot of the characters you might meet in Arkham, or even the investigators, may still be uh, recovering, or dealing with their experiences of the Great War, and so all these kind of little touch points in history that are bigger than Arkham, but impact on Arkham, are kind of important to at least acknowledge, and because all of them can again provide some level of inspiration and level of material support in terms of you know you know making sure that if you're doing a scenario where tracing some connection back to the Revolutionary War, you've got an idea of what was going on in Arkham, so you can kind of build that up from there in a sense. So it's all very important, but equally it's a balance, because obviously too much history is a lot of text, and it's not particularly always gameable text because you're scene setting, and so it's always trying to keep a balance. So that's why there is a what I would call a good section on history, but it's not overburdened, and it's not doesn't go on for too long, because obviously for some people they will love it and they want to get into it even more, and then it will inspire them to do their own research. And then for other people, they're not really that interested. You want to read it once, get a feel for it, but then get into the game material kind of thing. So it's always a bit of a balance with that kind of material, to not overdo it, but ensure that you've done enough to make sure there's something to work with, I guess.
Mm. And I found that very realistic. Uh, for example, Lancaster, a town in Massachusetts, they for them the French Indian War, with what happened with Mary Rowlandson and everything, very important part of their history. I wouldn't say they celebrate it, but they acknowledge it. They have special events and what you call it, like historical lectures about it from
Yep.
time to time. Um, it's really important, and it's not uncommon for that to be spoken about in Massachusetts. So I'm really glad for that. Um, Bookshops and libraries. Now,
Yes.
I want to be fair for the rest of anything not in New England, because I think almost most towns may, well, especially the older towns, may have like a special bookstore, a special library that's historically significant for them, and it's very true for New England. I can't think. It's rare for me to think of any library in any town here in Massachusetts where it's not important historically, helps not part that helps with the identity of the town, and so forth. And and I love that we have libraries, you have bookshops, used bookshops. Nothing says more to me about what a town's all about than seeing what the used bookstore is like in town. And if there's no used bookstore in town, that's to me a warning sign. Um, um,
Yes.
but I love that you include that there, because it's just a great. I mean, if not a mystery, if you can't think of a good mystery to bring players into town, nothing like having them meet at a bookshop or a library in Arkham. Um, it-
Yeah.
what was some of the creative process in creating these mini settings into the town?
Um, you picked a really kind of an easy one in sense, because I guess, as any writer does, you draw from your own experiences to some degree. And I think, as I mentioned, as a youth, I haunted secondhand bookshops in the search for horror stories and sci-fi books and all these kind of things, and I kind of have done ever since, to be honest. So it's kind of trying to build a, as I was, I tend to try and base my fiction in reality in that sense. So with Arkham, you've got not only you've got the really well-known library, which is the Orne Library of Miskatonic University, which most people who have played the game or read a bit of mythos fiction are aware of the Miskatonic University and its library, and we all know it's got like at a certain point it's got a restricted collection where the Necronomicon is in there and all these kind of cool things, and we all know it's there. But but in any town that wouldn't be the only library, because that's a university library in theory only for academics and students. What does the average Joe in Arkham, where do they go to the library? So clearly there'd be a some form of public library, um, and and then beyond that are the bookshops. And again, because it's a university town, in my experience, there's two sorts of bookshop in terms of in a university town. There's bookshops that cater for the students, and bookshops that cater for all the people that live in the town who aren't students. And so you kind of have a little bit of divide. And what that means technically is that university bookshops tend to have these academic texts and secondhand copies of their medical texts that the students will buy and then sell back to the bookshop on this kind of round robin basis every year. Whereas the other standard bookshops, they're selling the popular fiction of the day, and maybe some non-fiction as well, but they're selling the Dan Browns of the 1920s or whatever it might be, whatever the popular fiction it might be. And again, that helps to kind of build, much like the graveyards, different kind of flavors and atmospheres for the different shops. I mean, the other kind of dividing factor is it a secondhand bookshop or are they selling new books? Because again, that makes it quite different because, as I think, as you said, secondhand back, secondhand bookshops are a literally a kind of a black hole of possibilities because who knows where that book has come from or what you could find there. Whereas a new bookshop, well, it's more contained. It's just new books. You're not going to find Uncle's old journal at the bottom of a box of books that have just come from a house sale, whereas you might in a secondhand bookshop. So again, they all have these potentials for storytelling in different ways. They're also, with a game like Call of Cthulhu, it's not only about the books, it's about the people that frequent the bookshops and the staff of the bookshops. Because most people, in my experience, people who work and loiter around in bookshops are people who love books, basically. And so they've all got their own stories to tell. Why are they interested in books? Why does somebody open up a secondhand bookshop? What's their what are they in it for? And sometimes it's because they're collectors and they've got a very niche kind of idea of collection. And in Arkham, that could be they collect really bizarre old magical texts. And hey, Arkham, they turn up once in a while. So the best way to get them quickly and cheaply is to open a secondhand bookshop and be the supplier. And then you can get your hands on these texts before anyone else does because you're in the right place at the right time. That could be a reason. It could just be they love the smell of books or whatever it might be. But all these kind of different takes and ideas that kind of fly around if in the concept of a bookshop or library. Every book is a different story, and every story can lead you in a different direction in that sense, and not only fiction wise and plot wise, but also as help. Maybe the investigators need to learn how to do something that none of them are skilled in, and they can't find anyone to help. So maybe they go to the bookshop. Maybe they go to the bookshop to find how to make a thing, whatever it might be. Yeah. And then you've got a whole wonderful kind of situation where the investigators are kind of reading the book out aloud, and one of them is making this thing as they're going, and they're testing it, and then it all goes wrong, or they do something wrong, and it creates something even worse. I don't know. Who knows what they could find, especially in an Arkham bookshop. Maybe they find a spell that they think is going to help them in the plot, and all they've got to go on is what the book tells them, and the book could be lying, or whoever wrote the book could be lying, and they're actually doing something else to some horrible effect. Who knows? Or it could help them. I don't know. But all these are kind of possibilities that you can just feed in and inject into these locations.
I remember growing up, to get to my library in the Bronx, I had to go through at least two gang territories to get there. So I had to be really careful. Really, it was really dangerous. but it was worth it because being in that library, and it's not just finding the books that you want. Sometimes you just walk around and then you see something in
Yes.
the corner of your eye, and like, what is this? And you grab it and you bring it home and you read it, and it just opens up your world and everything. And so that's. But sorry, I'm going way off
No,
topic. What's the
no, but
book?
you're absolutely right. It's just kind of these oases of calm that can, who knows what will you not, who knows what you will find there in effect. And that's what I kind of like try to draw upon with a lot of the locations in the Arkham book. Is not just the obvious, like a book. We've talked about what you find in a library and a bookshop are books, but I've mentioned about the people that you meet in the book, and it might the interesting thing might be the person and what they know and what they can tell you, or what secrets they hide. It could be the environment. It could be the hey, that secondhand bookshop that the guy has just opened or basically bought from another person who's maybe passed away, has discovered one of the bookshelves is actually a secret door to a whole room of books that no one ever knew was there. What? That's suddenly a new plot has emerged. So location, people, the books themselves, and what about things people drop and leave behind, items and things someone's left some curious kind of bit of metal hidden between two books on a bookshelf, and nobody knows why. But this metal is really weird, and it kind of maybe got some sort of code or cipher on it. So all these things can happen in any location, but we're just kind of focusing on the kind of a bookshop as a kind of a starting point. But all of these things can build and start a plot or move a plot along in that sense. They can all be places where things happen. The investigators are all on their downtime, having you know basically thought they'd kind of destroyed this cult of Cthulhu worshippers on the other side of Arkham, and they're all kind of relaxing in their downtime at the library, taking 5 minutes out, to kind of chill out. And suddenly, the cultists, they didn't realize that it still existed, attack the library, and you suddenly it's like gunfire in the library because the investigators are caught off guard. All these things are possible.
Mm. So let's talk about something that's not a fun topic, really. Politics.
Oh,
But politics are really important in New England towns. Well, it should be important everywhere, especially on a local level. Um, I think sometimes the local level is even more important than what's going on nationally. I might have mentioned this, hinted this at the beginning of this discussion, but it's interesting how a topic can come up, um, and it could drive the whole town crazy, the whole city crazy, and just seeing people that seem very normal or happy, and you think you know them well, and then suddenly they just change 180 in their personality because of this topic. um, and I think in a way that's fascinating to me because that's in a sense what true horror is. I think true horror is it's not just monsters, it's people trying to grasp things that are beyond them. And sometimes politics, especially certain topics, it just takes them to that edge. If I may ask, was that sort of the thinking behind the politics in Arkham? Even though, to be fair, Arkham, of course, was made by Lovecraft, so there was a lot of already
sure.
context already.
Yeah, I
Um,
think. I mean, I didn't mean to be fair. I didn't dive heavily into the politics of Arkham, but I have built on what was in the original book and kind of tried to ensure that it kind of has a logic to it, and also to ensure there are some little potential plot hooks or inspiration for people that want to kind of explore that more fully. So there are sections around the kind of Arkham town government and the mayoral kind of process, and the what the legal kind of system is, and the kind of the court and so forth are there, um, and explaining that there is these different kind of officers within government, whether it's the assessor's office or the clerk's office, and what their responsibilities are, because again they can become contacts or points of information for the investigators. If they need to kind of look into um, census records and births and deaths and so forth, and marriage certificates and all that kind of thing, which again are all potential clue material in a Call of Cthulhu game. Where do they go to get them? How easy is it to get them? Who do they need to speak to? And not only the kind of transactional way, but in terms of, well, what if they become friends with the town clerk? Is that going to make their lives easier? What if they become enemies? How does And what if what if in the in the kind of the build up, as you kind of like growing Arkham as this kind of background to your stories, you kind of introduce a bit of politics, and maybe, I don't know, one of the investigators is a Republican, let's say, and they say as part of that they join the local kind of Republican kind of office and do a bit of voluntary work, and that's all kind of character development, background kind of stuff. But then they run up to the clerk's office wanting information, and the clerk is a Democrat, and somehow they've already tussled in the newspaper or on the street about some sort of political argument, and suddenly you've got some kind of character kind of development there that you can build upon in a kind of either a friendly way or an antagonistic way. So that's just a kind of a one small example, I guess, but it's trying to layer in these kind of possibilities. So we've put that at some point the mayor's going to change who the mayor is currently. Do the investigators get involved in that? Are they involved in kind of publicly shaming the mayor because they find that they're corrupt in some way, or they are a front for some cult, or who knows? Or maybe the mayor is their best friend because the mayor is really an upright citizen wanting to do well and sees the investigators kind of as a means to help them do that. There could all there could be downsides and rewards to these kind of relationships potentially, and you've got that kind of like framework of what the kind of the core kind of institutions are. But what I thought was really important was to build on what the next layer down, as I saw it, was. So these kind of clubs and societies that are across Arkham. So you've got quite social clubs and things like that, but there are kind of ones that are, semi-political to some degree, or have a vested interest in how Arkham is run. So things like the Chamber of Commerce and the Masons and the Ladies of Arkham, all these kind of quite traditional kind of organisations that are going to be more kind of concerned with how Arkham appears and how Arkham comes across, in its own environment and to the rest of the world. And so being part of those organisations opens players up to different kind of layers of politics and different shades of politics, which again could all be explored if that's the kind of style of game that you want to play. And again, as I've said many times, Arkham, the whole point of Arkham is it can accommodate pretty much any style of play you want to do. You just pull out the bits that work, that support you in that way.
Arkham has people that are well off sections and then people that are not so well off sections, the rich and poor. But I do like that there are sections that where people with money go to, where they hang out, what they do, and people that may not be so well off at what they do, where do they go to hang out. Now, was that something that was in the previous book before? Did you add that in afterwards?
There was a little bit of that in the original book. I think I did kind of build that up because I think one of the kind of things with Call of Cthulhu historically is he's tended to focus on the kind of that middle to kind of upper class kind of strata of society in terms of the investigators. They tend to be, historically, dilettantes and professors and people who are kind of, relatively well off, relatively in terms of their social standing, at least. Which that was always explained away. This is why they've got time to go and run around after ghouls and deep ones and things because they've got more leisure time, whereas working class people are just got to work to earn some bread. I always had a problem with that because I felt that there were just as good stories to be told if you are poorer as if you're richer in terms of a character or dealing with those kind of strata of society. So I did kind of beef that up a little bit as I went through the book because I felt the one thing about that I think, and this is kind of anecdotal, but the one thing about communities, especially in kind of these kind of sized towns, is that the kind of the less well off communities are more like communities. They tend to look out for one another. They tend to know what's going on in their community, and there tends to be a sense of kind of protection around those communities, and they're looking out for one another and so forth. Whereas well-to-do kind of areas of town tend to be more isolated. People are kind of looking after themselves and their family and their four square walls of their house, and not a lot beyond. But sometimes they do. But you're going to get these slight differences in kind of outlook. And for me, that kind of sense of community is really important in the game like Call of Cthulhu, because I think that's another way to kind of create plots and to create stories, is to have the not only the investigators at the heart of the story, but their community, and it's their community ties that are pulling them into action. Because they are the ones who can stop people disappearing from their local neighborhood, because nobody else is interested. The police don't care. The police have done an investigation, but they haven't really, because it's they're spending all their time actually dealing with all the problems of the well-to-do in Arkham. Where they get the political might from. Whereas like throughout history, poorer folks tend to be served less well with law enforcement to some degree, and so it becomes incumbent on those communities to kind of police themselves to some degree. And in a sense of Call of Cthulhu, that kind of policing yourselves is really important, because that means it gives the investigators a reason to be doing what they're doing. They are protecting their homes in that sense. So I think that's kind of the thinking behind how this kind of get layered into the different locations and districts in the book, is to kind of get that sense of what is the sense of community here? Is it on class lines? Is there kind of ethnicity lines? How do they kind of mix, and how does that work together? And because I think that's all kind of important kind of grist to kind of help to build not only the sense of community in place, but also purpose for the actual characters in the game.
I want to say real fast that I think this book somehow reads my mind, and I say that because there are times. So sometimes with other books that deal with the cities and so forth, sometimes I read something. Let's say, for example, the museum, and I'm like, oh wow, that sounds like a really great thing. I wish there was a map for it, and I'll turn the page, and voila, there's a map for it. We talked about bookshops and graveyards and so forth. Is there anything else in here that I haven't mentioned about that could be a good gateway or a good way for keepers to introduce this setting to their players?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's a question I've sometimes been asked: is where do you start with Arkham in terms of with a group of players? And I'm very kind of I'm very keen to kind of suggest the idea that you talk to the players about it and you have a discussion. It's kind of like if you imagine like a session 00 before you start creating characters. What you're all aware that you're going to kind of tell some stories and play some games in this Arkham setting. And so, number one question is: are we going to play a campaign? Whether it's a few weeks to a few months or a year or whatever it may be. What is our kind of time scale we want to play with? And or is it just we're going to do some one shots every now and again? We'll do another scenario in Arkham, because that helps you kind of form how deep you need to go to some degree. Because obviously, if you're doing one shots, you only need to worry about what's in the vicinity of your one shot in a sense. But I think that kind of thinking about whether your characters are going to be coming to Arkham from somewhere else. Maybe they all live in Boston or California, and they're all moving across or moving into Arkham for work or for some other reason. Maybe they're setting up some investigation bureau or something, or maybe maybe they're all academics, and maybe in different degrees. When I mean academics in a very broad sense, and have joined the Michigan University, and that's all their first year at MU, and that's what kind of binds them and pulls them together. Or are they students who have come from different parts of the US to start their kind of their student learning at Michigan University? That's one. There's a kind of different ways you can kind of pull people in to Arkham, or it might be that you decide, well, we want to kind of just play people that live in Arkham, that maybe they were born and raised here, or they moved here many years ago, but they're kind of part of the furniture now, and that's cool too. And one of the things I kind of like is the idea of you get out that one of the big maps you have in the Arkham book of all the sort of streets and all the locations, and you kind of say, well, you can kind of give a little bit of a brief overview of the different neighborhoods. This is where all the people that kind of own Arkham live. This is where the people that work in Arkham live. This is where all the students live, and so forth. And you can kind of give an overview very quickly and kind of say, well, where do you feel you would live? Where do you feel that your character that you're going to create is going to want to live? And you can kind of pick out literally the building on the map. You can go, well, I think they're there. And then as keeper that building is going to be that's not far from this bookshop, or it's actually just down the road from that graveyard, or it's next door to the witch house, or whatever it may be. And they're all potential plots for down the line that the player's not aware of, but you, just by placing them in Arkham, you're already building plots that are already written in the book, without you having to do any work. So you can kind of do that kind of group discussion and kind of get a feel for what is the style of game that you want to do, how long it's going to be, where the characters could live, and then you can start discussing the characters themselves. Terms of creating characters and how do they know each other? Do they all know each other? It might be that you want to set the first kind of scenario that kicks everything off in a shop, maybe a bookshop, maybe in a library, maybe in a graveyard, whatever reason, and then you work out why are all these characters in that place on that one day. And because what then happens when something crazy goes off is what makes them become friends and want to work together and save Arkham and save themselves and their families, because they've just seen what happens if you don't do something about it. They've seen the bad thing, and it's down to them because they're the only people that survived, and they're the only ones who kind of got away by doing whatever they did at the end of the scenario to kind of save the day. They're the only ones who know the story, the real story, and that is what inspires them to then become the secret saviors of Arkham. In that sense, how does that play out? So that's, I think, quite an important thing to kind of think about when you're coming to Arkham in terms of how you're going to make use of it, because it could be, if it's a one shot and I'm going to play the haunting and I'm going to set it in Arkham rather than Boston or wherever it's set, and you look at the map and think, well, I'm going to put the haunted house there in that neighborhood, and then all you need to think about is, well, what else is in the neighborhood? Can have a rough idea, and then you've got a sense of place. You've got a sense of when the players say, oh, what's down the road, and you can just look at, okay, well, down the road is a coffee house. Oh, we're all going to go there and we want to talk about our experiences. We're going to meet up there, and then you can build on it as you need to, but you haven't got to kind of, you can focus on the players and the story because the rest of it is done for you in a sense. You haven't got to worry about if there's a coffee shop down the road or a book, or where the bookshop is, or where the police station is, or whatever it is, because it's all in the book. And if you need that, you can just go to the index, look at police, there you go, and then move on with it. But you haven't got to worry about that in the middle of a game, is what I'm trying to say. You can use your brain power to focus on the players and the story you're developing and telling with the players. It frees you up effectively to do that, rather than you having to design the entire world yourself and then worry about whether players are actually ever going to use those places you've designed and spent all the hours designing the police station that the players never go to. Well, I've done that for you, so you don't have to. So you can focus on the cool bits, the game, because all that legwork has been done effectively for you, and you can use as much or as little as you need or want, and you can change things. If you find that you decide that you want all of the police force are in league with this cult that you've created, well, that's not written in the book because I don't know the cult you've created, but the police are all there, their stats, and if they're now all secret cultists, well, you're ready to go. You don't have to stat them out. You've got them all ready to go, and you can get on with it. So that's, I guess, a kind of a more general kind of idea around rather than a specific location, but to kind of help to kind of get a feel for how to begin with the Arkham book, because there is a lot of it, and there's a lot of information, as you say. And the trick is not to kind of bury yourself in all that information. You don't need to start. You just need to know where. Where are we starting? What are we? What is our outlook to go forward from? And then you can just build Arkham piecemeal based around the investigators and what they're doing. And the book is there as a kind of a constant resource that you can dip in and out, and reference between games, during games as needed, to help you to then to kind of decide, well, what happens next, or the players have said at the end of this session that they now need to go and visit this antique shop. Okay, well, I'm going to look up an antique shop, suss out, what's going to happen there, what put in the clues I want, for the scenario. But I've got the actual baseline of what the antique shop looks like and who the NPC is running it, and you can build that in your, between game prep, and it's, there as a starting point for you.
Keepers shouldn't look at this book as a shouldn't feel like books like these bully them, if that makes
No,
sense.
no.
It's it's a toolkit. And no one works on something and it looks at the toolbox and think, oh no, I didn't use that wrench. I am a terrible builder. No one thinks that. And we should feel that way about our books as well. We should just think about what our players want, what's the story, and then just take what we need from the book and build our fantastic worlds. Anything else before we wrap up? Any last words?
I'm just going to repeat what I say in the very start of the Arkham book, in the introduction. At the very end of the introduction, I've written this one line, yeah, which was my whole philosophy for the book: is nothing is set in stone. This is now your Arkham. Yeah, so you make it what you will, and you use what you will to make fabulous games, basically, for you and your players.
Mm. And one last thing. I didn't realize this the first time when we spoke about the book, but this is part of Arkham Unveiled, so there's going to be more books.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm doing is kind of, because originally you had Arkham Unveiled, you had Escape from Innsmouth, and Return to Dunwich, and Kingsport, City in the Mists. So these four kind of key locations in what was kind of termed these kind of Lovecraftian fictional inventions. And so I'm going to basically, like with Arkham, redevelop those kind of key kind of places in this kind of Essex County of the Arkham Unveiled line. And so I'm kind of currently working on Innsmouth at the moment, and then I'll move on to places like Kingsport and Dunwich, or Dunwich if you're English. Depends how you pronounce it. Dunwich sounds better though, doesn't it? Dunwich, and uh, building, like I've done with Arkham, building on the really good work that Keith Herber and Kevin Ross and others did with those original books, and looking to, where I can add more gameable material, more useful kind of stuff on top of all of those original kind of works, is the plan really. And again, with new maps and expanded maps and great artwork throughout, and just to make this kind of whole setting beyond Arkham come alive too. And that's all the kind of guide material. And obviously, alongside of these kind of books, there will be scenario books that are specifically set in places like Arkham and Innsmouth and Kingsport, which will you can then use within your own campaigns, or use as one shots, or to kickstart your campaigns, or however you want to use them. That they'll be there for you to do, and they'll be coming and rolling out as well. And lastly, I should say, obviously, we'll also look at doing a new version of the Miskatonic University sourcebook, because obviously in the Arkham book there's a big chunk about Miskatonic University, which tells you kind of everything you need to know, but there's a lot more, and there's a lot more kind of potential in terms of student life and the life of an academic and how that all works, and all the kind of possibilities that come with, like, being in the MU. So there's a source book for that as well. And when we've done all of these things, we're going to tie them all together with this wonderful campaign that kind of takes place across all these areas, and ties it all back together. But that's a few years off. I mean, it is written, but I've still got to get these other books out first, so I'm still beavering away at doing that. But yeah, so it's not just a one and done with Arkham. It's a foundational tome for the wider kind of area of this kind of Lovecraft country, kind of Miskatonic Valley area, which is all ripe with different possibilities for gaming and storytelling.
Mhm. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about more in depth about the Arkham book, Call of Cthulhu Arkham, which is available now on print and on PDF. I'll put a link in the description below. Viewers, thank you for watching. Be safe out there. We'll see you next time.